in this space. Well, greetings everybody. Welcome to our talk today with Professor Hicham Safieddine from the University of British Columbia, where he's a professor in their history department. Good to see some familiar faces here that have come to join us who have an interest in Lebanon and the region more broadly. My name is Peter Bartu. I'm a senior research scholar at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and I teach classes on contemporary Middle East politics. And what I've asked Professor Safieddine to do is to give us a presentation on his book around the topic of the rise and demise of Lebanon's financial system. Professor Safieddine will give a PowerPoint presentation and talk for about 25, 30 minutes on this. And then we'll open it up to Q&A afterwards. Just a plug for this book. I got it a year ago. I think it's one of the most brilliant examples of a political economy case study dealing with the banking sector and the financial system in Lebanon. And serendipitously, Professor Safieddine had it published in July 2019, within months of the start of the protests in Lebanon, which overthrew the government at the time, and the crisis of which continues to unfold to this day. The World Bank has called the collapse of Lebanon's banking financial system one of the worst economic crises of the last 150 years, just to give you a sense of the scale of it. But I can't think of anyone who's better placed than Hicham to actually present on his book, give us that point of departure, which will give us the best opportunity to understand some of the contemporary challenges that the country is facing. After his presentation, I'll field and curate Q&A with you all, and with a view to spending about an hour and 15 minutes and perhaps a little bit longer in this space if you are here still. So without further ado, it's my great delight, Hicham, welcome. Followed your work from afar for a couple of years now. You're a rising star. I'm delighted you could join us. And please.
Thank you, Professor Bartu. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you first for reaching out and inviting me. I would have liked to be in person, but I hope this will be equally engaging. And thank you as well for the very generous introduction and the endorsement of the book. We are gathered today a little more than 2 weeks after the second anniversary of Lebanon's October 17 uprising. On that day 2 years ago, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to protest the imposition of a WhatsApp tax. The tax was rescinded, but the people's anger did not. Now, the WhatsApp tax was only the hair that broke the camel's back of an already broken fiscal and monetary system. Since then, I know much has happened. There's been persistent crackdown on protests by security forces and by sectarian thugs. There's been a total shutdown of the banks. There's been a currency collapse, further breakdown of basic electricity services, a fuel shortage crisis that turned geopolitical, a pandemic, a bloody port explosion that killed over 200 innocent lives, and the worst may still be ahead. Now, it's hard to keep up with and make sense of all of these developments. And a recent surge in violence over the port explosion investigation has somewhat placed the question of the financial crisis and its harsh impact on people's livelihoods on the back burner. But this crisis is not going away. And we must not let the everyday and certainly the agenda of the political actors, who are, by the way, now plotting for the upcoming elections in 2022, to dictate our analysis or our outlook on what's going on in Lebanon. This is why I'm going to be happy to discuss any of the burning issues about recent developments in our Q&A, and also to update us, all of us, on what's taking place now that it's been 2 years. But I'm going to focus in my presentation on the financial crisis. And I'm going to do so in relation to both the past and the present. So we'll have a bit of both. For those of you who are interested in history, hopefully you'll get your fill of understanding the foundations of this crisis. And for those who want to really talk about what happened in the last 20, 30 years, and of course, since 2019, I'll hope we'll have a chance to talk about that as well. So as Peter has mentioned, my book was published in the summer of 2019. And back then, actually, so in 2019, very few people in Lebanon would have regarded the banking sector as a source of financial ruin rather than prosperity. Fewer still would have considered the Bank of Lebanon's governor, Riyad Salameh, as a failed and corrupt public official. As a matter of fact, if you look at the record, particularly the media in Lebanon, and even if you ask people in Lebanon at the time, they would tell you that he was an outstanding mastermind of currency stability. Less than 2 months after that, after the summer of 2019, after the uprising, the opposite became true. Suddenly, people started calling for the downfall of the banks and the ouster of Salameh, who was the thief. So people wanted their money back. But searching for immediate solutions to stem the tide of inflation or currency collapse, or to retrieve the money lost in the abyss of the banking deposits, leaves little time to rethink more fundamental features of Lebanon's political economy that were established in bygone times of colonial rule or post-independence state building, which is a period that is far away from the lived experience of young generations today. Now, the anti-banking slogans of this generation may reflect the anger of the moment, but in my view, it does not necessarily indicate a counter-hegemonic shift of how people conceive of the social and class function of the banking sector. And as a result, I worry that the antipathy towards the banking oligarchy may subside if, and that's a big if today, the current symptoms of the crisis subsides, which would allow the sectarian oligarchic regime of Lebanon to reproduce itself. So it's in the spirit of pushing for such a counter-hegemonic shift that I will first map out the structural features that underlie the foundation and growth of the financial system. This is the rise bit, at the heart of which lies the central bank. I will then discuss the contemporary crisis via a series of PowerPoint graphs. The purpose of this is to undermine claims about the cause of the crisis that are repeated, and I'm sorry to say sometimes ad nauseum, in the mainstream media and by politicians whose greatest skill is the perpetuation of their impunity. So let me start with my PowerPoint, and I'm going to narrate part of this with the PowerPoint to hopefully also visualize some of the arguments that I'm making. Okay, can you see the PowerPoint? Okay, great. So sorry, I have an issue here. Can you, I guess, if I do a full slide, I can't also look at my cheat and look at my written, can I? I can't, right? I don't know if, are you still?
This will work. This will work. Can you, even if you present it in this way, can you see your notes?
Yeah, I can. Can you see my notes though?
We can't.
You cannot. Okay, good.
No.
But this, okay, so this is fine though, right?
Yeah, we can see your slides. We can't see your notes.
Okay, so it's okay. There'll be like the sneak peek into the future slides, but that's okay. I have an extra.
Professor,
yes.
Would you like to make it full screen or?
How do I do that? So, well,
you can do
slideshow, you mean?
Yeah, play from the start.
Well, that's what I did. The only thing with that is but I couldn't get to my notes. If I did that, I would not be able to see my notes. My notes are on my computer.
Oh, okay. Then
that's the problem. So I'm gonna stick to this format if that's okay.
Would you like to click presenter view? Presenter view might fix that.
Okay, let's see. Here they go. Is that you see it takes over when you do that, the Zoom takes over your screen. So,
I can see that. Yeah, probably just sticking to what we were, or if you click the 3 screens, Professor, can you go back for a moment?
Yeah, I want, because I know not everybody. very quickly, because I know not everyone does finance. So I'm going to focus on the central bank, really. This is the heart of the problem that we are facing. So put very simply, central banks perform three major roles in the construction and consolidation of newly emerging nation states. So the first is they act as the government's financial agent for the purposes of fiscal management, and in certain cases, they do get involved in economic development. The second is they issue and manage a national currency whose circulation within national territory to the exclusion of other currencies create a monolithic monetary space. So this is something we all know, but we think it's natural, it's actually historical. And today with the rise of cryptocurrency, this whole concept is also being challenged. The third is that they regulate the banking sector and encourage the growth of deepening of national money markets. So it's the second and the third functions of the central bank that actually have we have a deep flawed problem in Lebanon with the second and third functions of the central bank. Now, in the case of Lebanon, there have been early calls to establish a central bank. They date back to the 1950s, although the central bank wasn't established until 1964. So here you can see in front of you a petition published in a Nahar newspaper in 1953, which is the paper of record at the time in Lebanon. And you have parties, organizations, citizens, a lot of very important social groups that were clearly calling for the establishment of a central bank. At the time, there was a private French bank that was running the affairs, the monetary affairs of the country. And this fell on deaf ears. This did not lead to the establishment of a bank at the time. And in fact, this is a petition that was also circulated by Philippe Hetti. For those of you who study Middle East studies, Hetti is one of the important founders of Middle East studies in the United States. He was speaking to the Foreign Department, the US Secretary of State, and he was actually convincing the Americans that we need to push for the creation of a central bank so that we can actually rival French presence in Lebanon. So this was a matter of international politics as well, as much as it was also a matter of popular politics. Now, why did this not happen? Why is it the case that we didn't get a central bank at the time? So what happened was the creation of the Association of Banks in Lebanon, Jam'iyat al-Masarif, which still exists today. And the BDL managerial structure, so the central bank's managerial structure and monetary functions were dictated by the dynamics of political power and financial profit. There was no policy of national economic development, and it was actually designed to serve rather than challenge the interests of an oligarchy of local financiers, such as the Iddi brothers, Rimo Iddi and Pierre Iddi. And they banked on the state more than the market. That's a major point I make, that they, as much as they claimed that they actually were about laissez-faire, they used the state apparatus to reproduce the dominance of the banking sector in the economy. This is not unique to Lebanon. We have that happening all around the world, but the way in which it happened and the scale of which this happened is really the problem in Lebanon. So the Iddi brothers were key figures in the founding of the two institutional pillars which turned the country's banking sector into an organized political community that was largely immune to state authority. The first pillar was the secrecy law, banking secrecy law of 1956. This was the architect of that law was Raymond Iddi. And he clearly said, and I quote, his greatest ambition was to turn Lebanon into the bank of the Arab world, just like Switzerland. And he wanted it to act as the money warehouse of the Arab world, the same way Switzerland is the money warehouse of Europe. And his way around that is banking secrecy, rather than some other form of economic incentive. And this, actually, you will see that the rise of the banking sector in Lebanon is very much correlated with this law. So the expansion, the explosion of banking in Lebanon in the 1950s, the multiplication of number of banks, the high increase in capital inflow really happens after 1956, after this law. So it's very clear that this law was a key factor in the growth and expansion of the sector. The second pillar was the association of banks in Lebanon. I call them the untouchables. And here you see Pierre Iddi, who is the brother of Rimon Iddi. He's a lesser known figure in Lebanese politics. And he's here on the cover of Majallat al-Masarif, the magazine of record of the banking sector in the 50s and 60s. So the Association of Banks was founded in 1959, and Pierre was a leading figure in its founding. The goals are clear. If you go to the record, to the archives, you'll find that the goals are clear. Sorry, I'm trying here to coordinate both. So let me just move on. And this is the Banking Association. You can see here, I'm going to skip the script and just speak based on memory. And actually, in this case, I'm going to revert to the current slide. So the Banking Association today, as the picture at the bottom shows, has become a very well-established institutional organization that has a very important say in the running of the government and the central bank. And you will see that the influence of the Banking Association, this is the triangle, so to speak, the triangle that we need to focus on, which is the bank, central bank, the Lebanese government, and the Banking Association. Now, what the Banking Association did, initially it opposed the establishment of a central bank. Then it hollowed out the law of money and credit. This is the law that governs the banking sector in Lebanon. It's still the one that actually governs the sector today. The law was issued in 1963, which was the same law that called for the establishment of the central bank. And there were many drafts of the law, and there was a correspondence between the government of Lebanon and the Banking Association about the content of the law. And you will see from the drafts that the Association of Banks actually eliminated several provisions that would have allowed the central bank to properly regulate the banking sector. It would have also allowed or enforced the classification of banks, which is a common problem. Just every time we have a big financial crisis, we see that when you have banks that are not specialized, banks that do everything, generally this creates risk and hazard in the money markets. And this is another provision that was also fought harshly by the Association of Banks. And eventually, the Lebanese government at the time succumbed to the demands of the Bankers Association. Now, after the creation of the central bank in '64, you have a major crisis, a major banking crisis, the intra-bank crisis. You see here at the bottom, this is Yusuf Beidas, who is a Palestinian Lebanese banker who establishes Intrabank and becomes the largest bank in Lebanon, controls up to 15% of deposits in the country. And Beidas, basically, his bank collapses in '66. There's a lot of conspiracies and counter-conspiracies that I discuss in the book and based on archives that actually haven't been dealt with before. But the main point here I want to bring to the table is the following. The intra-crisis leads to a refashioning of the central bank and the banking system. The bankers, unable to maintain deregulation in its most extreme forms, accept certain reforms of the financial system. There are three major reforms that actually take place in the '60s. The first reform is the creation of a deposit insurance scheme, which is modeled after the US insurance scheme. And this insurance scheme is supposed to protect depositors from bank runs in the future. And actually, it still exists today, but unfortunately, it's actually ensuring it hasn't been updated. The amount of money hasn't been updated. So the banking insurance scheme was a major transformation. The second was the creation of the Banking Control Commission, which was supposed to oversee banks and to actually take over banks. This institution and something called the Higher Banking Committee, these new institutions were supposed to take over banks that fail, kick out the managers, and actually either declare the bank bankrupt or restructure and refinance the bank. So this was another major development. The third was the agreeing to also create classification of banks. So the 1960s witnessed the major banking crisis prior to today's crisis. And during this crisis, the laissez-faire model that was constantly peddled by these bankers proved to be a failure. They agreed for certain reforms. And I should mention that these reforms and the resolution of the intrabank crisis also happened with active participation by what I call supranational networks. These are networks of individuals, powerful individuals, who were either financiers or politicians or diplomats, like Eugene Black, who was a famous World Bank head in the 60s and was also at some point, I believe, either a member of the cabinet or a consultant to John F. Kennedy. These networks were able to negotiate new reforms by speaking to the Lebanese government, also to Gulf states. A lot of the money in Lebanon was petrodollar money. The government of Qatar, the Kuwait private sector had a lot of money in Lebanon. So these networks were essential in the negotiation of a new settlement for the crisis. And we can ask, why did this not happen today? Or if it's happening through the IMF or the other actors, what's going on? Why was this different from what happened today? So the intra-crisis was a watershed in the history of the banking system. And like I said, although it actually introduced certain reforms, at the same time, it strengthened the stranglehold of the banking association because it failed to implement radical reforms in the policy of the central bank, which was also extremely conservative, not only in the regulation of the banking system, but also in its monetary policy, its currency policy. And we can talk more about that and link it to the crisis of the dollar and lira today if you want. So this is kind of, I've kind of talked about the main signposts, the main milestones in the fragile institutional structure of the political economy of banking, and the very important and usually neglected role of the oligarchy of bankers, who actually very much were connected to the sectarian political leadership. And in many instances today, actually, they're one and the same. But unfortunately, in Lebanese historiography, you always focus on the sectarian dimension. There's a fetish with sectarianism, and we don't talk enough about the role of bankers as political actors, as institution builders, and the role of the banking association. I mean, I call it the longest serving affiliation and lobby in Lebanon. It outlasts every other party. If you think of the parties today in Lebanon, this association is much older, maybe with the exception of the Kata'ib party. So this is something very telling about how we understand Lebanese history. So let me, in the interest of time, move now to the present. And also one dimension I didn't talk about is the conflict of ideas of reform. There was a very important role for US educated economists who were trained in the United States in the 50s and 40s and 30s and came back to Lebanon and were based at the American University of Beirut. And they played a very important role in the regulation and the calling for a central bank. So that's a whole other aspect of this history that I haven't talked about. So let's fast forward. We've got the Civil War, in which actually the central bank, because of its relative autonomy, managed to kind of remain at a safe distance from all the different warring parties. And then comes the 1990s, which actually inaugurates a new phase of the political economy of Lebanon with some new characteristics, but also some baggage from the past. So let's talk about what was still the same, what hasn't changed, and what also has changed. So, structurally speaking, Lebanon, I think many people know this, suffers from a serious uneven economy in which the balance of trade is negative. So very basically put, you always have more, you see the dark blue here, the navy blue, this is the export, and the light blue here is the import, and the difference is this whopping negative column. So consistently, this is the data based on the central bank data, 2014, 2019. You see consistently there is a balance of trade deficit. You know, Lebanon exports much more than it imports. Now, this is the case since the independence. And this is really a problem. But and this is the case since independence precisely because the mercantile financial class of Lebanon insisted on an overvalued Lebanese pound, and its interests lie in importation. It fought vehemently any kind of production. It was a little bit softer on the agricultural sector, and this is for also historical reasons. Now, what's the difference between then the past and after the Civil War? Now, although Lebanon has a trade balance deficit, it's always, generally speaking, had a balance of payment surplus. So although it exported more than it imported, more money came into Lebanon than the money came out. And the reason is because of the services sector, so tourism, remittances, the Lebanese diaspora and the role of the Lebanese diaspora in sending back money to their family, that's a big role, and also deposits by the diaspora and by historically Gulf capital. So these were the factors that at least kept the economy going. However, and sometimes, you know, you had ups and downs since the 90s. But if you look, and I think you can see the arrow, so we have a big surplus here in the first decade of the century. And mind you, after 2008, because of the global crisis, a lot of people parked their money in Lebanese banks. But notice here with 2010, you have a flip. Actually, you start having a negative balance of payments. This is a decade before the uprising. For anybody who wants to claim it was all the fault of those poor protesters who went down on the street and ruined everything. And this is very indicative because this is when the Arab uprisings happened. And of course, the Syrian uprising, and later on that turned into a war, the Syrian war. So we see here the impact of geopolitics, very clear impact on the incoming of money. So this is the first deficit, the second deficit, but the first significant and different deficit, the balance of payment deficit that was setting the stage for the collapse of today, for what happened today, and the inability to also recover, because crises happen everywhere. The question is, why do we have recovery in some places and not recovery in others? So another important dimension is the flow of money into the banks. So again, money comes in, it goes all sorts of places, but there also some of this money goes into banks, which is the banking sector. So think of the financial sector that as everything that has to do with currency and money and banking and non-banking forms of financial exchange, but a big part of it is the banking sector. So in the case of foreign capital inflow, again, you see that there are these dips. And you'll see a big dip in July 17. You see also another dip, for example, after 2006, with the Israeli attack on Lebanon. You see a big dip here. Also, when Hariri was detained in Saudi Arabia, you see a dip around that time, another big dip, of course, 2019. So what's the point of this? The point is to say that Lebanon, because there are no long-term incentives to invest in the country, it is a country of hot capital. So money comes in very quickly when people feel very nice and happy about it, but also money comes out very quickly. And money is highly sensitive to political development. This is also the case everywhere, but more so in Lebanon, where there is very little sovereignty, where there is an open economy, extremely vulnerable to transformations and changes, developments in the region and the world. So hot capital is another major problem that has exacerbated the crisis. And this hot capital, as we can see from the data, is generally connected to political developments and much less so to economic. Now, the financial bit about high interest rates is an important factor to the Ponzi scheme, which we can talk about. So we talked about the structure of the entire economy and the flaws of that structure. Some of these flaws persist from the past, like the balance of trade, the uneven structure of the economy. But there are others that I'm going to talk about. The debt is a new development. Before I discuss the debt, government deficits, right? We have we have triple deficit in Lebanon: balance of trade, balance of payments that I talked about, and a government deficit. Now, in the case of government deficit, one of the things we hear all the time on the news, that the problem is we have corruption, we have waste, which is all true, but also that we need to fix electricity. There's a lot of money going to supporting electricity power, the hydroelectric power generation, and wages, public wages. We hear this when we talk about austerity, not just in Lebanon, around the world. Now, if you look at the numbers again, this is 2018, before the crisis. You'll notice the two biggest expenditures of the Lebanese government are actually public wages and benefits. This is the 32% here I'm circling. And guess what? This is wages and benefits, 35%. And we have a 32%, which is actually, which you don't see here at the bottom, is payments of interest on the debt. So, and the electricity is at 10%. It's not the major, it's still an expense, an important expense, but keep in mind, we need to interpret this socially. And I mean, like in relation to society. These wages are the wages of the salaries of tens of thousands of families. And electricity is a public good that benefits everybody. Meanwhile, the biggest expense, or one of the two biggest expenses, is the servicing of the public debt, which goes to probably a very small minority of people. So when we talk about austerity, it's unfortunate there's always a focus on, spending, but there's little focus on the debt, which is actually a major problem and expense. And even if you go into wages, this is another important point. If you break down the wages expenditures, you will see that the teachers, for example, that are always complaining about, salaries of teachers, they're a mere 18%, whereas the army and the internal security forces make up, in this case, over 61%. So no wonder that there's a crackdown on the security, on the people, because these are the beneficiaries of this regime. And actually, again, we see that the military and security apparatus, and again, this is not an anomaly. We know in the United States, so much of the spending goes to the military, it doesn't go to other things like education. So again, it's a structure that is showing us where are the real expenditures if we want to reform government spending. So the debt itself, just a few comments on the debt. Basically, there are some features about Lebanon's debt that are very problematic. Some of you also might have heard of. First is dollarization, which means that a large amount of the debt, or a substantive amount, is in US dollars, which is very rare in the world when a government actually borrows in a currency not its own. And this is a problem because you can't pay it back. You can't print dollars, right? Only the US can print dollars at will. So this is a major structural feature that is a problem. The second structural feature is that unlike most global South countries, the United States, Lebanon's debt is held initially mostly by local banks, by domestic banks. So you don't have the problem of IMF conditionality. You don't have the problem of dependency on a foreign government. But in the case of Lebanon, you have the problem of being hostage to the banking lobby, because they own the debt, they control the debt. So that's another major reference to the role of the banking lobby and its influence on the currency. The last slide I'm going to show is about the people who put their money in the bank. So as you can see from the slide, these numbers have changed drastically since the crisis. These are pre-crisis, which is why it's about explaining the underlying problems that led to the crisis beyond the day-to-day politics that we hear. So if you look at the structure of deposits in the Lebanese banks, which actually constitute in total close to 4 times the GDP of Lebanon, constituted, because everything is changing very fast, which another anomaly, and it shows the unevenness. You shouldn't have a banking sector that's 4 times the GDP when also your GDP is very small and is not diverse. So in terms of distribution of wealth in Lebanon and concentration of wealth, you're going to see that almost 82% of 82 billion is owned by less than 1% of depositors. So the vast majority of money in the banks are owned by a tiny minority. And this is both very problematic because of the impact it has on wealth gap, but also it is the key to solving the crisis. Because if you do apply a major haircut on these people, actually the impact is going to be, in terms of socially speaking, just on a very small minority. So these are kind of, in very basic terms, some of the major problems that are actually at the very heart of the demise of Lebanon's financial sector. I'm going to conclude with some remarks, and then hopefully we can open the floor for discussion. So sorry, did I unshare or not? It's unshared, right?
Correct, yep.
Okay, yeah, all right, thank you. So let me conclude by saying that the colluding relationship between the Association of Banks and the central bank, which took shape in the mid-20th century, had laid the ground for an ever-growing financial oligarchy that survived financial crises in the past, that is, economic downturns, political turmoil, foreign occupations, and a prolonged civil war, 1975 to 1990. By 2015, and amid a struggling local economy and a dwindling middle class, private bank holdings, as I had mentioned, had grown to almost 4 times Lebanon's entire GDP. On top of that, and thanks to financial engineering by the central bank, the bankers continued to finance the state and make in return handsome profits. Local Lebanese banks were holding more than 50% of the country's ballooning sovereign debt. And as I mentioned, their share is uncommon in the annals of sovereign debt of developing nations. Now, these mechanisms that I talked about, which range from colonizing by lending in the 20th century or IFI conditionality, did not apply directly to the case of Lebanon today. In the case of Lebanon, it's the government's ultra-conservative monetary policy in the post-World War period that advocated small budgets and avoided state borrowing, even for economic development, has turned into one of the largest borrowers of the world. This has made it initially less susceptible to foreign intervention, but it did not imply a guarantee of independence from foreign influence and local manipulation. It is taking full account of these financial foundations, not as a one-time event in the past, but as an ongoing process of constructing state-embedded regulatory regimes that is a major step towards envisioning a strong and stable economic future that is neither subject to foreign dictates nor subordinate to private banking power. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Hicham. That was extraordinary, really. Incredible background and overview. And so everyone, if you've got questions that you'd like to ask of Professor Safieddine, then I'd welcome you to type your questions in on the side there, and I'll address them shortly. But Hicham, this begs the obvious question, doesn't it? Because I've sort of, how does Lebanon get to the circumstances where it can re-regulate or create that reform moment and move on to a more stable platform moving forward? And I know that this was the essence of the discussion at the end of 2019 and into 2020 among activists, among people on the streets, among the many constituent parts, because they realized really quickly that this was at the heart of it. You mentioned that some of that debate has been stifled by some of the, or pushed aside in a way, displaced by other challenges and regional issues and so on. But are there mechanisms? Is there still a vibrant conversation among stakeholders here about the type of haircut that could be given, the way of addressing this, how does one get onto a a shared common vision of, the economic future. That's not just a discussion about elections in 4 months' time or 5 months' time or wherever it is. Where did that energy go, and what are the possibilities here? Really important question. I know it's a hard one, but
so
love your
yeah,
thoughts.
Maybe it's good to just quickly point out to the main things that happened on this front, particularly since 2019, because they also kind of set the stage of what can or cannot happen, especially that today, actually, with the new government, with the Mikati government, there is a serious attempt to address this issue again. Mikati, for those of you who follow news in Lebanon, spoke, I think 2 days ago, had a press conference about what to do with the banks. And he suggested that people should wait maybe up to 20 years before they get the money back, when his own wealth is increasing. Sorry, I'm just going to make this quick comment and get back to your question. Yep. When he was appointed prime minister, he became teary-eyed on TV because he was worried about the mothers who can't bring milk to their families. And I went immediately and I looked at the Forbes index of wealth. And on that day, he became richer by $12 million on a single night. So this is just to see the huge disparity and interests between those who currently want to change things and who could possibly make a change. But let me go back to some more substantive point about where to go, but also what has happened. So we have several problems that, things are getting worse, unfortunately. So what the opportunities are narrowing. That's there's no question about it. And this is the reason why. The first reason is, after this big momentum to hold the central banker and coaches accountable, there was no progress on getting a basic audit of the central bank. So I gave you these statistics, but a lot of this has changed. And we still haven't managed, for all sorts of reasons, to get a proper audit of the central bank. We do have some evidence based on the government plan, the Hassan Diab plan. So that was another moment I'll talk quickly about. So the first point is, we still didn't manage, whether internally or externally, to get a proper view of what's happening inside the central bank, if it's not without having to rely on simply the words of Riyad Salam. So that's the major issue that still isn't resolved. There is some progress in some places to hold Salemi accountable, including some actions in Switzerland and other places. So on that front, and actually, the longer we wait, the more pressing this is going to be. The second point is about the distribution of so-called losses, which we hear about a lot. On this regard, the banks are already, as we know, passing on the losses to ordinary people by transferring the money in dollars to Lebanese pounds at the old exchange rate, 1,500, when in fact in the informal market, the US dollar is like 20, 21,000. So my point is, there is already a plan taking place. We're not at a deadlock in that sense. They are actually gradually reducing the holdings of the majority of the Lebanese people at a big loss. So I think they want to get to the point, exactly the point that Mikati just spoke about 2 days ago, where you have just big depositors. And these big depositors, their hope is that we will create a sovereign fund where all the revenues of the state, so they want to now milk the state and recuperate their losses by creating revenue from the state income. So that's the view they have in mind, the long-term view. Now, there was an attempt at one point by the Hassan Diab government, with all its shortcomings, that was very good. I think that's what we need to go back to. We need to go back to that plan, because that plan, kind of relatively speaking, had a bail-in, a major bail-in. So at least, at the very least, the people who own the banks are actually, live up to their own share of losses, because they made a lot of profit from debt service. They didn't really make profit. So that plan can be a kind of a framework, a reasonable framework to start the conversation. The problem is that plan was both actually, unfortunately, in my view, totally attacked by the civil society and people on the street, and also by the banking party and the elite, because they didn't want it. So it was very convenient to completely kill that plan. And then later on, of course, the explosion in Beirut happened. So that's the second point, is that there is a somewhat of a kind of a skeletal plan, but there's no political will.
Right.
Now, there's a third element to any solution, and that third element is the foreign actors. Because in any crisis, especially in a country like Lebanon, you require fresh capital. Like you can't, create money out of nowhere.
Right.
And unlike the 60s, I should say, when if you look at the archives, although many people in Lebanon thought that the intra-crisis was an American conspiracy, that they wanted to, actually, if you look at the archives, the Saudis were happy with intra. They wanted to punish Lebanon the same way they're doing today, because there were a lot of pro-Nasser and nationalist forces in Lebanon. Whereas the United States government, not out of goodwill, but they said, listen, Lebanon is the only case of free economics in the region at the time. So let's not collapse it. So we wanted to stay a good example. And that's where they sent Eugene Black and then other people who came in and they intervened. And so there was this activity. And of course, the crisis wasn't as big as today. Today, you have an external environment in which the people who hold the money that can help Lebanon are actually trying to further collectively punish it and deny it any attempt. And I'm not suggesting we should give the money to these politicians, but what I'm trying to say is any attempt to create some fresh capital to get things going, the opposite. We have sanctions. So we have US sanctions, direct or mostly indirect sanctions. We have a Saudi policy that is explicitly about starving Lebanon of money. And then we have the other important dimension, IFIs, like the IMF. The IMF doesn't have a same kind of political agenda, right? It works within certain parameters. In the case of the IMF, firstly, there's the losses are so big, it's very unlikely that only the IMF can actually solve the problem. Secondly, the IMF, of course, comes with conditions and that are going to probably harm, the people. This is, it's going to be austerity. So that's the point. And thirdly, when the IMF tried to negotiate with the Lebanese government, it got conflicting signals from the Lebanese government. Now, most recently, there is some unified voice within Lebanon under the Mikati government. The IMF actually was a helpline recently by giving Lebanon through the SDR system, these are special drawing rights, close to $1 billion. But again, this money is probably going into a punctured bucket. So the picture I just painted says that, to me, is a catch-22. I don't see any relief now. Now, this is why the elections, this is why everybody, unfortunately, they're just counting on the elections. Some people think if you have a change of majority, so the new majority is more sympathetic or allied to the Western camp, maybe this will create some leeway. But I just see at least 1 or 2 years of continuous kind of degradation. And then the hope is that some political force in Lebanon kind of, comes out and creates an alternative, which will hopefully open up foreign interest in a way that doesn't also, I would argue, that these are my views, undermine the basic interest as well of Lebanon. So it shouldn't be, this idea of we give you money so you do our bidding and your phone point. So I'm sorry, I don't really see, I see the threads where we should start. These are the things we should think about, the 3 main things, but how we implement them is the problem.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you. It's your comprehensive response there makes me I feel like that sometimes in the classroom when I'm talking about challenges in other parts of the region. But I'd like to return to some of that shortly. But there's a question from Mark Abizade in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see it. But the first one is, what role did the bank secrecy law play in the current financial crisis? And I'm just on that. Is that still in play? Does that impact the questions of either audits or forensic audits?
Yeah, so thank you, Mark. How are you? The first point about the secrecy law, it played a very important role because it was used as an excuse by Salemi repeatedly to actually deny the Minister of Finance the right to look at the books of the central bank, which is a right actually guaranteed, the right of the minister by the money law credit. So as you know, Peter, there's always, the law is, everybody will use it to their own advantage. But in this case, so it was used by the central bank. The second way it was used is by denying the government the right to know who transferred money out of the country. So we didn't talk about this, but those of you who follow another problem is a lot of these politicians and bankers, they spirited the money out because there are also no capital controls. That's the first thing you do when you have something like this. Lebanon did not impose capital controls. Right. So the banking secrecy was another major weapon to deny people the right to know who actually sent the money out. And then it became all about corruption. So if you were involved in corruption, we could actually expose you, but if you're not, we can't. And then good luck trying to prove some of these allegations of corruption. So that was another way in which the banking secrecy law played an important role. Now, in terms of the crisis itself, I would say on a structural level, the banking secrecy law is precisely what brought so much money into Lebanon, plus the high interest rates. Right. So also, in a way, the banking secrecy law is actually supporting an old-fashioned system of attracting, in my view, shady money. Like, why do you want this money? Even the Swiss, by the way, consulted with the Lebanese government in 2016, and they advised them to change their banking secrecy, because even the Swiss now under increasing pressure because of offshore and other forms of hiding money to actually reform their own system. So these are the three ways I would say. The second is, sorry, yeah, I think, yeah, you asked me about the 60s, or this is what Mark is also asking.
That's right.
Could government use the 60s reform law you mentioned to take over the banks and erase the public? Not in theory. They can do in practice in many respects. The laws allow them to. And as a matter of fact, the parliament can just convene right now and create any law it wants. So there are laws that allow, this is the technicality. None of the banks declared stoppage of payments because that would trigger this process. But they all, for all intents and purposes, they stopped paying. Right. So the law would have allowed probably the Banking High Commission or other to actually, put its hand, so to speak, on the bank and fix it. None of the banks have done this. None of the banks have closed shop. None of the banks have declared bankruptcy. It's incredible. None of the banks have merged. I mean, usually you'd think, some of them would come together. And I mean, there is some talk, by the way, of some buying and selling going on. There were some reports now of people starting to buy and sell. We still don't know their balance sheets. We don't know if they're actually solvent versus simply illiquid. How are we supposed to reform the system if we don't? If we don't actually at least save the good banks and reform, fix the bad banks. So the question of information, if there's anything that can be done, but again, we get information and then we can't do much with it. But at the very least, knowing the information will allow for a plan B. And I always tell people who are active, because we don't have anything happening right now, don't wait till it happens, because then you want to be ready to govern. You want to be ready to reform. So you need to actually do as much work as you can. And you need to have policies ready, and you need to know what exists in the banking sector, so that if an opportune moment comes in the future, you can do it quickly, because otherwise people won't wait for you. People don't wait for these things. So, to go back to the point of, yes, there is quite a bit that can be done, but again, there is a complete lack of will to do anything, because, it will hurt their own interest. And because it's a collective crisis, it hits everybody. All the banks are kind of in on it together at this point. But there's a lot to be learned from the 60s, what happened in the 60s. 10 banks closed. And actually, after that, there was a new influx of foreign capital from American banks. They started buying Lebanese banks. Notice how in Lebanon today, we don't have a single foreign bank except like the Arab Bank, I think. That's not a coincidence. A lot of them left after the debt in dollars in the late 90s. They knew that this was a good environment. Yeah. Fascinating.
So I've got Samira's got her hand up, but I've got Samira before we take your question. I don't know if you can type your question into the chat box on the side there, but I've got Mary Saba, who's asked, can you talk a bit about the unofficial policy to disincentivize production in the industrial sector? And is this, in your view, about maintaining the dominance of the finance sector? And how is this related to the present?
So the policy was multi-pronged in the 40s. See, what happened was there was a nascent industrial sector in the 40s because of World War II. All of a sudden, when it was convenient for the British and the French to have actually local production, also because of the breakdown of trade routes and trade relations in the 40s because of the war. So you had an interesting and growing and promising industrial sector. Now, I'm not talking about heavy industry. I understand there are limits to what you can do in Lebanon, but there was a sector. And in the late 40s, this sector was fought nail and tooth by the importers and by the merchants, who, and including Michel Chiha, the founding figure of the Lebanese state. And they were deregulatory regime that was implemented, so complete deregulation of trade. We all know that all industries at some point, even in developed economies, require some form of support, at least initially. So there was a complete lack of any support. Actually, there were attempts to create development banks. These banks would have financed some of these things. Also, this attempt was partly sabotaged by these people. So in terms of economic development itself, directly speaking, yes, there was a deregulation, complete deregulation. And so that's the direct. The indirect was the currency, the monetary policy. So they stabilized the Lebanese pound at an overvalued rate, which always benefits importers, doesn't benefit exporters. And they tied it to gold in the most conservative of ways. And when the third aspect was government expenditures, which is not just about supporting the industrial sector, but also about capital investment and things that would actually enhance private investment, in an indirect way. So all these things were happened, and there was a scaling back on industry and even agriculture, but I would say, speaking of the present, because you're asking about the present, the unevenness was still better than today. So we're still talking about 15 to 20%, if my memory serves me, of the economy was industrial and agricultural in the 50s, 60s. Now I think it's like 2% or some ridiculous amount. So it is related to the present in the sense that we do not have a well-established industry that could jump on board and immediately, for example, because of devaluation, as we all know, this benefits the export sector. If you had an existing export sector that was small, it would capitalize on this opportunity, like people do in Turkey or other countries. We don't have that today. So 2 years in, we still have some initiatives here and there. So the fact that there wasn't, to begin with, a well-established, prevented a quick response and a quick capitalization on what exists today. And in terms of the government, it's still doing the same. It has these small initiatives, but the government still thinks the same way in terms of what it does.
Fantastic, Hicham, thank you. So we have this question now from Samira. Thank you, Samira, in the chat on the right-hand side. Can you read that?
Yeah, or Samira, yeah, sure, I can. So she's asking, can you please reflect on the concept of sovereign debt and its relationship to the sovereignty of Lebanon more generally? I guess everybody can read it, right? I can just read it and answer, or do I need to read it out loud?
Oh, no, you can, yeah, that's right.
Okay, so the sovereign debt. This is a key point that before 1990, with all the negatives I talked about, the Lebanese government managed to avoid sovereignty, which is why in the civil war also it wasn't in big trouble until the late 80s. The sovereign debt, the concept first, this is, it is the debt that is owed by the government to non-government entities, very simply put. It's called sovereign debt, sometimes it's called public debt. And we know almost all governments in the modern era have some form of sovereign debt. The question is the two things mainly. The extent of this debt in relation to the economy. So a major factor is how big is this debt compared to your GDP. And Lebanon is one of the highest in the world. It used to be the second highest before the crisis after Japan. But as you can see, because Japan is a production economy and has all sorts of things, we worry less about Japan than we worry about. In the case of the States, you worry less because the States has enough military power that if anybody comes and says, we want your money, they know how to say no if they need to. But Lebanon can't afford that. Or most developing countries, they will be invaded or something will be, they will like implement some. So sovereign here is about sovereignty in terms of the ability of a nation to actually defend itself against impositions and conditions of debt. So conditionality is another major aspect of debt, which is why it's sovereign or non-sovereign. So this is also a legal question. It's a question of who has the right to claim a debt and who doesn't. And usually sovereign debt is also called sovereign because technically speaking, it is the highest authority. So no one has actually the legal ability to, which is very odd, now we're talking about theory here. It means that governments can keep issuing debt forever. Because they always, technically speaking, if they legislate sovereign debt as sovereign, like you can't, and you can't sue them. Sometimes you can, but the point is they issue bonds and then they can issue more debt. And because they tax the population, they can always retrieve some money to pay the old debt or impose it. So it's almost if it's voluntary tax almost in a way. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's imposed. So these are different aspects of sovereign debt. Now you're saying in literature on colonial that the emphasis is on external forces that challenge the sovereignty of state, turning them to semi-sovereign. Lebanon's challenge to sovereignty seems to come from the inside. Very true, but I would say both. So the ability of Lebanon to actually, the Lebanese state, to decide what it does is hindered by the banking lobby, but also it's unable to borrow externally because of the sanctions, because of the collective punishment, because also as a developing nation, nobody wants to carry Lebanese pounds. So it's not liquid, its currency is not liquid internationally. Whereas the US, for example, I use it because it is the most powerful financial power, but we can talk about the sterling. Maybe in 30 years, we'll talk about the renminbi. If you're a powerful economy, you also have high sovereignty because you have high liquidity because your currency is more likely to be actually liquid. So, and the fact that also Lebanon was borrowing in dollars, that's one added lack of sovereignty because they cannot print money to pay their debt. So it's a very important question that I try to talk about in the book. And I focus a lot more in my book on the internal lack of sovereignty with the banking lobby, because I think it's a neglected aspect of Lebanese history. But definitely it shouldn't make people think that, oh, it's only beholden to these forces. No, definitely, like I said, like the sovereign funds of the Gulf states are about $1 trillion. If they want to support, now they could easily, just like they did with Egypt. So it's a political question as much as it is also for the people of Lebanon. I don't also want these corrupt politicians to get more money without some form of accountability. So it's a bit of a catch-22.
Terrific. Thanks, Hicham. Does anyone else have any more questions that they'd like to put forward personally or in the chat box on the side? I'll open it up for one or two more. Good, Mark Abizade has one. I've got one more related to the contemporary moment, but Mark, please, if you could, feel free to unmute and ask it personally.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I wanted to ask about the one of those charts that you were showing of the inflows and outflows of money coming into Lebanon and out of Lebanon, and it showed, well, firstly, it showed a big spike in 2009. I wonder what was the reason for that spike of inflow, and then all of the years after, I think 2010, there was a lot more outflow than there was inflow, and I want to know the reason for that too, and if that if depositors forecasted this collapse that happened a couple of years ago, and if that's partially to blame for those outflows, and what event triggered the collapse 2 years ago specifically?
So the first point about 2009, this is right after the financial crisis, the subprime mortgage crisis that became a global financial crisis. And this is when, as I mentioned, actually a lot of expats and others parked their money in Lebanon. Now, according to what I've looked at, but I haven't looked at enough, my conclusion talks about everything after the Civil War. So those have to be taken based on, I mean, I did research enough to write that chapter, but not enough to do the stuff I did on the pre-war, which is I really know the most about. So it appears that the Riyad Salemi at this point, he actually did prevent the banks from engaging in some risky forms of borrowing. Because of the secrecy laws and the relatively stable banking sector at the time and the high interest rates, it looks like a lot of capital was running away from global markets and parking in Lebanon. So that's the reason for the positive. And this was, commended. Salemi was commended about this. And to be fair, fine, it was a good move. So we have to give, we have to be fair when we assess it. So that's why you had a big shift. The other bit, like I showed the other slide as well on the balance of payments, the 2010-11 is the beginning of the uprisings in the Arab world. And eventually the most relevant to Lebanon is the Syrian crisis. So this is probably where you see money starting coming out. Now, there are other factors, and I haven't, again, we have this graph I showed you. I focused on hot capital and political aspect of it. We need to do a better study, I think. We need to find out when did people start taking their money out? I did mention a blip. I think it is after Hariri went to Saudi Arabia. Was this basically was it partly an attempt to also destabilize Lebanon? I don't know. So you see, I always say history is not a conspiracy, but there is conspiracy in history. So we have structural weaknesses, no question. Nobody can come and tell us this is all politics. No. But when did people start coming out? Who was actually taking their money out? I think it was mostly people connected to very high places. I think, I don't know enough. So it wasn't ordinary people thinking, people started actually getting super worried after the financial engineering in 2016. So if you see money coming out before, it's likely for other reasons, or somebody who's really super in on the balance sheet of the central bank. After 2016, the ratings started changing. And financial engineering was a clear indication, public indication that there is trouble. So I think those are the things you can think about, but we need to look back and really look closer at what's happening in each of these places to find a conclusive answer.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And Hicham, a quick follow-up on my side. That financial engineering post 2016, are you really referring to where the interest rates go ludicrously high to attract investments up to 30% in some cases, I understand?
Well, these high interest rates existed in the 90s, by the way, 30 and 40%, which is the beginning of the problem.
Right.
And initially it was justified because this is reconstruction after Civil War. And rightly so, yields on interest on debt in the developing world is higher than other places. It goes both, again, this is the, I would say, the uneven global structure of capital markets. And now the excuse or the justification given is because it's riskier. So this is why it's higher. But then it doesn't have to be this high. It can be a few points high, right? It doesn't have to be this high. So the high rates begin in the 90s, then they dip after. Then when they're not borrowing, they start Eurobonds, which is Eurobonds is just dollar, borrowing in dollar. What happened in 2016 was a scheme that was concocted by Riyad Salemi to pump money into the private banks by doing swaps of Lebanese pounds and dollars. I won't go into the details, in order to attract more money to pay the government for debt. So you're right that he did increase interest rates, but what he did was he did this formula whereabouts you give me your dollars for like a rate, I give you Lebanese pounds at a higher rate. But then if you're still at $1,500, these money, Lebanese money, you can speculate. You can go and change them to dollars as a private person. So there were these huge profit margins between Lebanese and dollar debt that he did in order to continue to finance the government. And when people complained, he tried to kind of fix everybody. So the usual sectarian aspect, oh, you did some engineering to this bank, it's linked to Hariri, this bank is linked to Basil or something, let's make everybody happy. So that's what he did, and he did swaps. He did these swaps on the books, everything on the books.
Well, thank you. So I have one more question in relation to the future, which is you have a new US administration, clearly, and that seems to be taking a slightly more measured approach, not entirely, but there's some opening at least in terms of the energy sector, potentially involving Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, which could provide some assistance there. And you have quite a strong and interesting push, certainly from the UAE and the Russians, in terms of trying to get the Americans to lift the sanctions under the Magnitsky Act that have also had an impact on the dual economies of Lebanon and Syria. Are either of those initiatives through the energy sector, or if the Emirati-Russian push to basically bring Syria back into the public arena as a regular state, Arab League and so forth, do they have any, would they have any potential to influence the contemporary moment to energize some, better possibilities for Lebanon in the here and now?
Yeah, well, that's an important but also thorny issue. And I'll address the economic aspect and then the political, although they're, as you know, quite connected. So in terms of the energy, the question of energy, and you're absolutely right, we've witnessed an apparent American green light for Lebanon, not just Syria. The Lebanon just signed an agreement with Syria to actually permit the transmission and importation of electric power from Jordan through Syria and to Lebanon. Although the price, I'm looking at the prices, and that's the question of benefit and cost. So economically speaking, and also what will happen in Syria will absolutely impact what's going to happen in Lebanon. So a gradual de-escalation of sanctions and also military confrontation in Syria, whatever is left of it, and the ability of Syria to reconstruct and to bring in more money might definitely have a spillover effect into Lebanon. However, there are a couple of caveats. The first is the extent and scale of this impact is going to be very limited if we don't have the fundamental reforms we discussed. So a lot of it is going to actually, in my view, strengthen, not weaken, the current regime. So it will provide it with more energy, so no pun intended, to continue to actually safeguard its interests by redistribution of some of these windfalls. So that's what I'm really concerned about. And we know that the US administration, although of course it's nowhere near Trump's, they're not, I don't think they are not interested. They don't see Lebanon. They have the major policy in Lebanon has to do with Syria and of course Israel. So far they're not, I don't think they're going to care if we have a proper reform or not, because it's a long-term question. The second point I would say is, and I have my strong views on this, is that this, détente is happening with also attempts to draw the borders with Palestine in the south. And this is connected to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I would not want a solution that would be on the backs of the Palestinian people, personally. And if we do have that without also proper resolution to the conflict in Palestine, this is going to basically exacerbate the situation. So, and I also don't see a resolution of the border. So it's interesting, the energy bit you talked about, it was almost a second attempt, because I don't know if your listeners know, but a lot of the electricity generated in Jordan actually comes from Israeli companies who are actually excavating in Palestinian land, in my opinion, and not in my opinion, I would say that's my view on things. So this is a way of, non-resolving a political issue through economic means. So I am opposed and wary of these attempts. I would really like to see a proper reform of the Lebanese system, and the US government, unfortunately, even the Biden one, and is really using every card to normalize relations with Israel rather than resolve the problem. So I'm, I look at this with concern.
Thank you. Wonderful, comprehensive response. So we have one final question from Mary Saba. When will we get our money back?
I think she said that her mother is listening. That is actually, will we get our money back? Which is I wish it were when will we get is it when or will? What does it say in the chat? Will we ever get our money back? So yeah. And first of all, I don't know your mother, Mary, but I know that so many people, including my parents, who have worked very hard and have put all their savings in the Lebanese banking system and have trusted the system. And unfortunately now they have been completely betrayed. So again, I cannot predict the future, but it is in all, first of all, if your mother has money in dollars and she's getting them in Lebanese pounds, she's already lost a good chunk of her money. It's already lost. We have to accept that. The second, if she still has some money in the bank in dollars, it is possible that she will get part of it. It is almost unlikely she will get all of it. Again, this is depending on what they will do with the banking sector. Like I said, we don't even know. What we know is there's a huge loss. So if I had to bet, the majority of the money will not be back, unfortunately. That's the sad truth. So if you've managed to take it out somehow, there is a small chance it will be back if they do the reforms or if they create a plan in which they pay you back. But also they will steal probably the state funds to pay individual people. So I always tell people, I fully understand the individual loss, but I would say also for the future, think of the money as a pool like water pool. We put all our money there, right? We can't distinguish between all of it. And now they're taking money out of that pool for their own ends. We need to refill the pool, not just for the people who used to put money there, but also for the future. So even if I say if people don't get some of their money back, it's a consolation if we get a proper functioning banking system and economy that benefits you, if not your mother, or me, if not my parents. So yeah, the short answer is, it is unlikely, but you might get part of it if they do the reforms.
Hey, Hisham, I have a follow-up question. What happens to individual debt under these circumstances? That is, it completely changes. I mean, the category of individual debt is no longer.
Well, this is a good question because there are winners and losers. So actually, I know people who had borrowed from the banks to pay their mortgages. They're now paying it in Lebanese pounds peanuts. So there are people who can't pay the debt anymore. They have defaulted, which is why it's creating a further instability in the banking sector. So individual debt is also a case where actually it's people who are in debt. So if you lend the bank, is when you put money in the bank, you're lending the bank. If you lend the bank, you lose your money. If you borrowed from the bank, you're in a good situation. So this is the opposite of what we're taught, that if you borrow, you're better off, and if you save, you're good off.
But it's also, I mean, what is interesting about it is that individual debt is also a mechanism of governmentality. That is the way people are made to stand in line and to endure work in order not to endure more debt and to pay off their debts, right? It's a mechanism, some call it, of financial terror.
They're actually, yeah,
and
I mean,
so now we have something else here.
But even then, to be fair to what you're saying, the banks are forcing people to pay their debts, but no one is forcing the banks to pay back the depositors. So people who can't afford to are refusing to pay their debts, but they're still being pursued by the banks. Now there are also court cases between both. So people are also going to the courts to adjudicate this question. So we have chaos. So we really, it's not clear. There's no trend in this. There's, you know, each person is trying to save themselves. And I understand that dynamic, but it's incumbent on the people who, the leadership, the political leadership, and the people who want to change to think of this problem collectively. We can't just think of it individually, although I understand why people would. I just hope that people who are leading change think of it beyond just, you know, give us our money back.
Terrific. Well, we've come all the way to 1:30 very, very quickly, in my view. Hicham, thanks to your extraordinary knowledge and an eloquent presentation of it. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope the next time will be in person. This story is not going away. And good luck with informing everyone about it in your lucid way and for the future. And yeah, thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure. I want to thank you personally for inviting me and for actually your engagement with what I've talked about. And it's been a pleasure also speaking to everybody. And I want to wish the center all the best with the extremely active presence and analysis on the Middle East. So all the best to you and everybody there. And I do hope we get to meet in person.
Very good. Thank you, Hicham.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.